Hello everyone, I'm Finlo Costain, the Chief Editor of 8.9 Hectares. Thanks so much for joining us for this Alternative Food Summit. At the PM's Summit this week, a package of measures to support British farming was unveiled. These included greater protections in future trade deals and the abandonment of plans to merge the Grocery Code Adjudicator with the Competition and Markets Authority. The summit, however, failed to address the enormous existing and future fragility in Britain's food system or its impact on the natural world, public health, global supply chains, or indeed the well-being of those actually living and working in the countryside. Now, before we go further, let me just say a few words, if I may, about 8.9 Hectares, because it's new. So 8.9 is a multimedia news channel supporting knowledge transfer for people working in land-based sectors and linked supply chains from food to fashion, people who actually have the ability to deliver food and fibre production integrated with climate mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity regeneration. Our website is 8.9.com, which I have put in the chat, or you can search for us at 8.9 HA on Google. We have new articles every day, TV news with a guest interview 3 times a week, live discussions like this, and 8.9 is also the new home of the Farmgate podcast. I am joined by 7, yes, indeed, 7 superb panelists. Martin Lines is the chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. Phil Stocker is chief executive of the National Sheep Association. Martin and Phil were both part of the privileged few who were at the Downing Street Summit, and they're going to report back in a moment. Then Natalie Bennett, if she manages to join us, is Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle from the Green Party. Sue Pritchard is the chief executive of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. Rebecca Mayhew is the Pasture for Life farmer from Old Hall Farm in the lovely Suffolk village of Bungay. Ben Reynolds is Deputy Director of Sustain. And Dan Parker is the Chief Executive of Veg Power. We have an hour, we have a lot of ground to cover, but we will have time for questions in the last part of our time together. So please do add them to the chat, which you can also use to introduce yourselves and comment as we go along. So 2-minute contributions, everyone, please. Martin and then Phil, was the Food Summit worth attending? Was the PM listening or simply broadcasting?
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's a broad statement there, and thanks for the opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity for the Prime Minister to bring focus around food and farming. There were some positive announcements around the trade deals and standards, and actually having firm commitments, things like chlorinated chicken and hormone beef won't be imported into the UK and undermine UK farming production. Fairness in supply chains, investigating in that, they are all positive steps, and I think we should recognise those points. And it was a very narrow audience. It was about farmers, supply chains, and the producers. And it was a very narrow conversation around the individual issues, not about the approach we have. The real big issue around where food, farming, nature, climate, the impact food has on our planet, and the impact it has on is having on our supply chains. So within the event, we had a reception in the garden. We had an address from the Prime Minister. We broke out into breakout groups and sort of raised our concerns and issues. And it really is about the next steps, I think, going forward, of how do we join it, make the conversation wider to bring in those other sections that weren't in the room or weren't part of the conversation that actually will help us fix long-term food security and supply chains for longer term.
Phil, what do you think?
So was the summit worth attending? Well, that was a question that I asked myself because I missed NSA Welsh Sheep to be there, which was a major event for us in Wales. So it was a question I asked myself. But on reflection, I think it was worth attending. I think the fact that food is now being talked about more openly has got to be a good thing. For the government to come out and hold a foods summit where, for a long time, to me, all the conversation has been about climate change and environment, and I just feel that we need to be thinking in a more holistic way and connecting all those things together. Having said that, the issues of climate change, the environment, nature recovery, the protection of natural resources, human health, a few of those things were mentioned during this during the actual summit. But overall, I would say it was a good thing that it took place. It's quite rare, really, surprisingly, maybe, that you've got people from the farming sector, the processing sector, the retailing sector, and the catering and hospitality food supply sector coming together to talk about some of the challenges that we all face. It was very much dealing with the status quo, today's food supply chains, and not thinking about maybe adapting some of our food supply models. It was very, very export focused and very little mention of the domestic market, let alone more localized markets. The Prime Minister, I think, was very much in broadcasting in mode. And if you look at some of the photographs that were taken, there were an awful lot of Rishi Sunak with Caleb from Clarkson's farm, probably more photographs of those two having a loving than there were of anything else. But having said that, I think there had been a lot of listening that had taken place in advance of the summit. So a lot of that listening had been done previously, I think. And ministers and the Prime Minister were involving themselves, ministers and the Secretary of State in particular, I'd say, were involving themselves in discussions and getting into the detail. So overall, yeah, I think it was a positive initiative. It was 4 hours only, limited what you can cover in 4 hours, but I was glad that I attended.
Thanks very much, both of you. And I'm interested, Martin, because I think both of you have said, it was a status quo event and lots of things were missing, but it was still important to have that event because it brought these different stakeholders together. You were talking about, moving this forward positively, Martin. How do you think you can build on this and move things forward?
I think it's for all of us to build on it. There's not one person can do this. There is so many things need fixing and joining together. But we've got to sort of hang those items on that agenda around food and supply chains and the current issues. Many of the solutions discussed were the short-term fixes, not the bigger picture. And we need to expand that conversation and really hope and drive DEFRA and hopefully the Prime Minister to hold another event in the future where we can join that conversation and make it wider to really tackle our food supply and food security issues in the future.
Maybe as a result of this event, we can draw together some thoughts, perhaps after the event, looking back at what people have said and send those to the Prime Minister so that we can perhaps prompt precisely that. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're only here for 10 minutes because you're out of school and you've got to go and talk to other people live. I'm just wondering if you were pleased that the Food Summit took place at all and what you thought about the outcomes.
Well, first of all, I should apologise for my unconventional background. I just had to climb a Sheffield hill in a hurry to get a 4G signal. But what I thought about the summit happening is I agree with Phil very much that at least that it happened.
I think we're struggling slightly. Natalie, we're not able to hear you, and I'm just wondering if I think you said that you've gone to get a curry in order to get a signal. You might need to get your money back. Yeah. I think we're just going to wait another moment. I think we're going to have to give up on Natalie, which is unfortunate, not least because she doesn't realize that we're giving up on her. No, I think we're going to have to move on, aren't we? From what Natalie's saying. If Natalie manages to find a reception, then we will come back to her at the moment. As I say, she unfortunately has to leave us for another engagement, but at least she's making the effort to try and be there at all. So moving on, I'd like to ask what our other panelists thought of the summit, and in particular, what was missing from the summit. So Dan, did anything about the Food Summit surprise you? And from your perspective, what else do you think the Prime Minister needed to hear?
Well, I was expecting little more than a large plate of waffle with a side serving of window dressing. And I think what we got was a kind of little taster plate that just left us more hungry at the end of it, really. So, yeah, fair pricing in fresh produce. Yes, massive fan. It's going to make Brexit look simple. Good luck, go for it. Right. 60% of our food being produced here in the UK. Absolutely couldn't agree more. We're currently going in the wrong direction at a very rapid pace, particularly in horticulture, because of the aforementioned fair pricing. So I think In terms of a tease, yes, great, really excited. Now you need to get into the detail. It's going to be very hard. It needs to be very collaborative. It is a massive mountain to climb. But if that's the ambition, then I hope we can all get behind it. In terms of things that weren't covered there, I could probably fill the remaining time we have listing those out. But, it certainly for me, I think there are some significant issues around food poverty, lack of food education. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on that and the general health and well-being of the nation, which is really pretty appalling at the moment, as we've seen in some of the stats that have come out this week in terms of the cost of the NHS. So I think there's a lot to cover, but I left the thing feeling quite pleasantly surprised at the lack of nothingness.
Right. Okay. That's great. Thank you. Good point to end on. Natalie, we're going to try and hear from you again, because I know that you've got to go. I'm sorry, we didn't hear anything that you said. So if you would just like to try and repeat it. We were talking about the food summit, whether you were happy that it took place at all, whether you were happy with the outcomes.
Well, I agree with Phil that I was very happy that it took place. When you think about the fact that Boris Johnson, a few prime ministers back, was saying that food security had nothing to do with the government. It was all just for the supermarkets to be left to. So that's a positive step forward. But what was really lacking, I mean, there were many things really lacking. First thing was really lacking was any mention of nutrition or public health. If you look at the government readout, neither of those words appear anywhere. The fact that we have a deeply unhealthy diet, more than 50% of our calories from ultra-processed foods. And what I would say is, what do we need to do? What sort of things do we need to be talking about? We need to be breaking the oligarchical hold of the supermarkets and of the major food manufacturers. I mean, I once had a small row with the government health minister because he said, well, what we've got to do is manufacture healthier food. And I said, well, how about we talk about growing food and producing food rather than talking about food being something that's manufactured? We've got to get the government to acknowledge that ultra-processed food is a thing. And as I think it was Phil who said, the focus on exports, the government's own government food plan, food strategy, the first food, if you call it that it mentions is Scotch whisky. Now, I've got nothing against whisky, but that's not part of the food system that we need to be looking towards to be able to, ultimately, I would say 60% is not nearly enough. We should be looking to near self-sufficiency in food. That means allowing people access, small farmers, many more people to enter farming and growing. It means opening up land. It means breaking the hold of the supermarkets.
Why do you think that near 100% food self-sufficiency is important?
Well, obviously, the first point is food security. We're in an unstable world, the age of shocks, whether you think COVID, whether you think the climate emergency. But there's also the question of what right do we have to expect other people to feed us, using their soil, their water, all things that are under extreme pressure. And also, it's we know that shipping food around the world, particularly we should be eating far more fresh vegetables and fruit. And that's something that should ideally be grown in a ring of market gardens around each town and city. One of the things was, I've forgotten which minister it was who said, well, let them eat turnips instead, when there was one of our lettuce prices recently. And it was pointed out that we actually import more turnips what we eat than that we grow locally. And that is just it makes no sense at all.
I wonder, in terms of practical policy mechanisms, what you and what the Green Party would like to see in order to make the food system fairer, both for farmers and the general public. And I guess there's a whole supply chain in between, but farmers and general public in particular.
Well, I think what we have to do, I talk about breaking the hold of the supermarkets and their dominance. It's government policies that have allowed the supermarkets to dominate enormously. You think of how they manage their fruit and vegetables, which is overwhelmingly wrapped in plastic, cheapest ways possible. So what we've got to do is privilege, support small independent businesses. I came in originally behind NAB Farm Shop that I'm here behind me, a different kind of food system that really grew up and grow and increase during the pandemic. We can grow that, support that. Farmers markets, local markets, a different kind of system. Whereas instead of just privileging the supermarkets and assuming that they are the people who will feed us.
Thank you. I'm going back to the 100% self-sufficiency, because I think that's really interesting, and I think it's a high figure. And I wonder if we are seeking to become near 100% self-sufficient, then presumably there's an onus on other countries to try and do that for themselves as well. And so I wonder, what you feel about the export market going forwards. from the UK?
Well, I have no objections to high value specialist things. Some Scotch whiskey. I like the odd banana. I had one for breakfast. I certainly like my coffee. Those are not things we're going to grow in the UK. So exchanging small amounts of high value, attractive things, spices, all of that sort of stuff. What we should be talking about is the majority of the food on your plate. And of course, that should not include factory farmed meat. That needs to be far more vegetables and fruit. And that's, not just me saying that. It's not just that we need to encourage that for the farmers. We also need that for our health. Most of that on your plate should come from fairly locally.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Natalie. Really good to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for struggling through your Wi-Fi challenges. And I know that you've got to go off and talk to school students. So thank you for being with us. And I'm just going to move on now to other panelists. We've already heard from Dan, but I wonder if perhaps we could hear from Ben from Sustain. What do you think the Prime Minister needed to hear that we didn't hear?
Thanks, Finlo. As Dan said, I can't sort of pretend to show much surprise for the long list of things that are actually missing from the summit. I suppose the question is, who is it for? What was it for? It did come across like a bit of a PR stunt to try to appeal to farmers and rural voters in the light of recent local election results. If it was focusing on food security, I just on that level alone, possibly a lot of the things that have been mentioned do go some way to supporting farmers. So the commitment around the grocery code adjudicator and supply chain fairness is welcome, because that was on the ropes, and new inquiries into supply chains in eggs and horticulture, welcome. And I'd like to come back to some of the points Martin raised at the end. And I think the question is, are these commitments genuine? When you look at the recent announcements around stitching a horticulture strategy, and more broadly looking at a real lack of commitment and ambition in response to the National Food Strategy, which did such a good job of actually looking at some of the systemic levers, many of which have been widely ignored by the government. And more broadly, again, looking at things around delays around dietary health, key dietary health legislation. This is welcome that it's happening, but only in the context if there's going to be further action. And certainly when you look at the lack of action, and if in fact negative action in recent months, it just doesn't come across as being particularly genuine. So I'd say, what is going to happen next? I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that this is only one part of that picture. If we're talking about food security in terms of household food security and affordability, this really needs to go hand in hand with efforts to make sure that, particularly for those people on the low income, they can access healthy, nutritious food that is grown locally, or at the very least, some of the food that's being grown if we're supporting British farmers. And I'll hopefully also have a chance to sort of come on to some of the ways in which government could very easily be doing that later on in this session.
So I think what I'm hearing is that you're glad to see that there is some focus from the Prime Minister and the government on these issues, but there's perhaps a lack of understanding about the detail, and you're concerned that the commitment is skin deep, I suppose, in the wake of the local election results. Well, let's hope that it isn't, and that we're able to do something more to sort of build some momentum. Sue, I wonder what your thoughts are.
I mean, I share a lot of the observations that have been made already by colleagues. I've just come back from a couple of days at St George's House in Windsor Castle, which was talking about global food security and particularly the role of civil society in those sorts of conversations. And it just reminded me, in contrast to the conversation that had happened in number 10 the previous day, how central food is to the global polycrisis. It's at the heart of so many of the challenges that we face, but also how many creative ideas, creative solutions, civil society and other actors have to make to those particular challenges. So in asking the question, who wasn't there and who should have been there, pretty much everybody outside the fairly narrow supply chain wasn't present in the room. And I fully acknowledge, as Phil and Martin have said that there were some promises made in the context of tweaking how things work at the moment, but it is almost impossible to imagine that those people who are currently the core beneficiaries of broadly how things work at the moment would be the ones to come up with the truly innovative, truly creative, truly radical and challenging solutions that I think we all need. We know that that's what citizens want. So the People's Plan for Nature just a couple of months ago had in it recommendations from citizens for a national conversation about food, about retailers and food processors becoming much more transparent about the real impacts of their supply chains, and for businesses to stop producing foods with negative impacts. Now, I'm guessing that wasn't really much of the conversation that was going on in the room. So sorry, go on.
No, so I was just going to come back, because the national conversation is something that you're clearly, running at the moment. I'm aware that, all of the stakeholders, all of the issues that we're talking about today, there simply wouldn't be room in Downing Street to put on an event that speaks to all these people. How are you managing to achieve that conversation in a creative way?
Well, let me just say, I think there certainly would be room in Downing Street. There certainly would be room to have a lot more of a reflection of the real system of stakeholders for transformative change for food systems. What we're going to be doing this year is picking up on that recommendation of the People's Plan for Nature for a national conversation about food, and running a whole series of events and meetings and gatherings around the UK to ask citizens directly, so what do we really want from food? Recognising that very often businesses and lobbyists make claims on behalf of citizens. Citizens just want cheap food. Citizens don't care about climate and nature. Nobody wants a nanny state. Make claims about what citizens want without really having that fully supported by knowing what citizens really do say that they want. So we're going to go out and ask those questions directly of citizens to try and shape a more robust response to food systems change.
Yeah, fantastic. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us. Great that you're here. We've already talked about the way in which, a lot of the representatives at the Food Summit in Downing Street were from, organisations within the status quo of the food system. Pasture for Life is outside the status quo. What do you think the Prime Minister needed to hear? Oh, we've lost Rebecca. Just as her moment was about to come, we're going to give her a moment. Back. Oh, are you? You're back. Fantastic. I just can't see you.
I'm back. Sorry, it's the joy of living in rural Norfolk. I'm delighted that there was a food summit. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Yes.
You can. Excellent. I'm not sure that the Prime Minister or any of his advisors and many of the people that were there at the summit really realise the extent of the crisis that we're facing, not only from a food security crisis, but a biodiversity crisis. And I'm still very worried that they don't realise, and many advisors don't realise, we have to start living within our ecological means. And I fear that this is a fantastic stunt for Instagram, and it's great at getting voters, but I didn't see any real engagement with smaller farmers and people who actually, like we grow food and sell it to people. There's a lot of processes involved in the discussions, and they're all looking for their profit at the end of the day. I didn't hear enough about ruminants and how important they are from an ecological perspective, and from the point of feeding people a really good nutritious diet. It's so good to have food so high on the agenda. If we're lucky, those of us who can afford to eat 3 meals a day, there's a lot of people who can't afford to do so. And I think that privilege is taken for granted. But I think such a lot of education is so important at all levels, because people have been taught that food is not important. It's the thing that you scrimp on. And I think we need to start seeing food, as we will speak about in a minute, as something that you buy for your health. It's not just fuel, it's not just a quick snack, it's not just to satiate some sort of base desire, it's actually far more crucial than that. And we can't do any of these things without looking at our ecology as well, and trying to to grow our food in a more ecological way.
Fantastic. So that's food not just as calories, but as part of our own commitment to our own health and an ability to work, I suppose, at the same time as supporting those other aspects within our community and our economy. Let's talk specifically about the crises in health and nutrition that we have in the UK. Dan, how do you think our food system needs to change to address those crises? Dan, you're on mute.
Apologies for the amateur error there. I'll give you three thoughts because the list is very long again, right? But just three thoughts. I think really the key central issue for me in the whole thing is what I'd call the cost conundrum, is that our vegetables are really too cheap. And if we want to have a healthy, secure and sustainable farming system in this country, we need to have a higher price at farm gate, which will mean a higher price at retail. At the same time, we have millions of people in the UK who are struggling to put food on the table and feed their families. And that is the core issue that sits at everything here, is about money. And the only solution to do that is some form of subsidization of food, whether it's through welfare, through tax, universal free school meals, better quality, healthy start, but we have to find a way to fix that conundrum. Second one for me, which somebody mentioned earlier on, is we are flooded with ultra processed food. And this is highly flavored, highly refined carbohydrate in shiny packages with little or no nutritional value and fantastic marketing. And it is highly destructive to the planet and it's highly destructive to people's lives. And we need to get that conversation in that footing and move people towards real food, fresh produce. The third thing is that whatever changes we make, the reality is that we will continue to have a negative food environment, hopefully less negative. And we have to equip our young people to be able to navigate a unhealthy food environment in a way that's healthy and sustainable. And that means food education. And we need a lot more food education all the way through from early years to secondary to equip people to navigate the complex world in which we're in.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Ben, health and nutrition, what do you think we need to do?
I mean, I suppose just building on Dan's sort of overarching sort of points, I think it's sort of worth maybe kind of going through a few specifics. So we had a children's food summit up in Leeds when the government was doing its food summit. So it was great to hear from lots of different children from the Food Foundation youth ambassadors about what they would like to see action on. And, you know, it was very similar to the issues that we were covering at the day. So, you know, action on making sure that food is affordable, and particularly for struggling families, and hearing from a lot of the attendees about their struggles with being able to afford to put food on the plate, but equally things around junk food marketing and just the kind of what we call the obesogenic environment. But I suppose just thinking about some of those things that are achievable right now, I think a real focus on fruit and veg, supporting British producers. This is why the ditching of the horticulture strategy is so, let's say, annoying, devastating. It's frustrating. But, you know, things around trying to get that into the school fruit and veg scheme, expanding that from a point of view of health inequalities, expanding Healthy Start vouchers and improving the uptake of that. Things around extending free school meals, taking a universal approach. This is something that we've seen more and more places committing to, whether it's Wales, whether it's London. We've now got York, who are going to be piloting a universal approach in primary, which is fantastic. That's one of the first areas outside London in England to do that. Whether it's extending the soft drinks industry levy, we've got some new polling out early next week. I probably shouldn't be telling you this stat because it's not published yet. 68% support for extending the soft drinks industry levy to other products, if that money is going towards things like the soft drinks industry levy did originally, so breakfast clubs, things like the holiday activities fund. Coming back to, I think Sue made this point earlier around this perception of nanny statism, and I really recommend reading Henry Dimbleby's book because he does a big section on this and why we should just kick out the idea of nanny statism, because it's not an argument that really resonates with very many people. Actually, it's just right-wing media. When you've got that huge amount of public support for these measures, this is an open goal for any political party to be really championing these. I could go on and talk about things like extending advertising restrictions, promotions, bans, some of the work locally that's going on that could be rolled out that at the moment is being undermined, particularly by corporate pressure. So
Let's do that another day, Ben.
Local food advertising policies and restrictions and healthy takeaways. I'll put some links in the chat box.
Yeah, no, please do. And you know, we'll come back and we'll have another webinar looking at the detail of this as well. This is a broad overview. There's lots going on in the chat. If you have a question that you think is a question for the panels, please make that clear so that when I'm glancing at it in just the few seconds that I have, it's easy to spot that. That would be really helpful. Sue, and then to Martin. There's a food price crisis, as we've just been hearing, as we all know, and at the same time, there's a huge disconnect between the cost of production and the price that we pay for food at the checkout, or however we pay for it. In nature, we're faced by an existential crisis with an urgent need for change and investment to mitigate and adapt to global warming and to regenerate biodiversity. So how can we address cascading crises in nature while ensuring food remains available at prices that people can genuinely afford?
The problem that we've had is that food has become politicized. We just haven't noticed it. It's become politicized and financialized so that, first of all, powerful corporates can make increasingly substantial profits out of a thing on which we all depend. And it's been politicized. It's the most elastic product in our family budgets. Compared to, say, housing or energy, which are also, you know, very high and very inelastic. So the pressure to keep food prices cheap are essentially a political decision to allow for fluctuations in other important parts of the economy, other sectors. But that's become very hidden. It's not a conversation that we talk about. But in order to disrupt that pattern, we need to recognize that, to start talking about it, and to think about really transformative economic solutions. And that means recognizing food centrality to the economy, to health and well-being, and starting to plan and finance a transition plan that manages to tackle multiple crises simultaneously. So a funded transition plan for agriculture, for farmers, that allow them to both grow healthy food more sustainably in a way that does tackle the climate crisis, becomes more resilient in the face of climate crises, and protects and enhances nature, as well as providing good livelihoods for farmers, reasonable livelihoods for farmers. Sorry, were you butting in there? Did you want me to stop?
Yeah, I'm going to butt in. I'm going to butt in if that's all right. There'll be an opportunity to finish off if you need to. Martin, I want to come to you and just see, you know, what you think in that context of how can we address the crisis in nature, which costs money, it costs time, at the same time as keeping food prices affordable.
I'd kind of also go back to, have we got a food crisis, or have we got a society that can't afford to eat and prepare good quality food? We need to have a food that's priced up that actually reflects the impact it has on nature and climate. Because if it doesn't balance those up, we're actually offshoring that cost somewhere else, and we're picking it up through the NHS, through water bills and various other bits. So how do we get that food system right and society that can afford quality food? And it's about the price points and the availability of their access to good quality food that balances that off. Nature is underpinned, or food production is underpinned by nature and climate. And if we don't concentrate and really focus around our climate and biodiversity crisis, we will be in real trouble in not too distant future around our food security. So we really need to join the impact our food has, and we know much of our food production has massive impacts to climate and to biodiversity, and attach that cost to the production of food, so we can move away from that high cost to society for the impact it has, and eat a better diet. But we've got to train children, we've got to train adults to cook, prepare, and understand what food is. Many people haven't even got a decent cooker in the house. It's just a microwave. So that ready meal or that ultra-processed food is their regular diet. We have got a lot to change, but we need to have a clear process of putting it in place. And we need to keep it focused on the government to put that wider agenda into place as well, rather than just pick out individualized areas to put some focus and attention to.
So some of that is about recognizing that there is a need to recruit nature, as part of the farm business, as a farm worker in effect, rather than seeing nature as a cost, and then building in those costs so that prices still remain at a point that people are able to afford, and all those other changes that you were talking about there. Rebecca, I'd like to ask you, and then Phil, a similar question. Major retailers have an effective monopoly over prices and people's diets, while independent supply chains are largely used by highly motivated customers. How can we increase access and participation in independent supply chains in order to improve that choice for customers and payments for farmers?
Yeah, I think having listened to what all the other panelists have got to say, we agree on a lot of things. Food security, environmental security, food being medicine, ruminant livestock. I think what we need to understand is the power that these large processors and buyers have got over the entire food chain, how people think and how they eat. I mean, market is designed to make you want, they rush you through the fruit and veg, and then they take you to all the lovely addictive sugary things. And it's all about profit. It's about looking at, following the money, what drives the supermarkets and the large processors. It's money all the time. That their priority is not healthy people, and it really should be. They have the power to have a positive influence, and we need to educate them and ask them to stand up for people so that we can change things for good. That way we can actually address all of these issues. But it is all about profit. So, we have a very diverse business. We don't just sell our own food that we produce on the farm. We buy in from other people. And I always make sure that we are selling at a fair price. And that is a choice that I make. And it is a choice that the processors and the supermarkets make. We aren't self-sufficient in eggs yet in our shop, and I'm trying to find farmers locally I can buy from. I was speaking to a supplier the other day, and bearing in mind we know how short a supply we've been with eggs this year, we're nowhere near self-sufficient. My supplier was saying, well, I'll try and get these cheaper for you. And I said, no, don't. 10 pence an egg to buy in is too cheap. Pay more. And we're just not trained to think the right way. We don't value food. We need to educate the processors.
Bill, I wonder if I can come to you. We're talking about increasing access and participation to independent supply chains. What are your thoughts?
I'd like to make one very general point and then one very specific point. First of all, and this relates back to the Food Summit, I think the government's interest in food is really welcome. Whether that's genuine or not, I don't know, but it is really welcome that it's being talked about. But I think it's got to be recognised that the government's interest in food within the context of the Food Summit is around its agenda of economic growth. And something that came through to me is that, and I don't know whether the stats back this up, but food exports and food manufacturing probably contribute more, are assumed to contribute more to economic growth than localized food production or food supply chains that are more related to cooking from scratch. People struggle with holistic thinking, don't they, Ray? But I don't think within this context people are really understanding the value of circular economies. I don't think they're really valuing or understanding the value of local economies either. I think we need to recognise that in different people's languages, there's a difference between food security and self-sufficiency. And even with a target of 60% of food we produce here, consumed here, if you balance that out, I think that we'll end up with still a proportion of that 60% being exported, as long as we import the balance. And we can prove that actually 60% of what's been consumed here has been produced here, even if part of it has been exported. I don't think there is a connection with self-sufficiency and localized supply chains. But then to be very, very specific, it's quite interesting, I think, in the sheep meat market that retailer dominance is not what people might think it is actually. At the moment, I would suggest that only 20, maybe 25% of our British produced sheep meat is sold through our multiple retailers. They're really not dominant. We're quite lucky in having a lot of independent markets, if you like, but what I know, talking to lots of young sheep farmers, next generation sheep farmers coming through now, is that they would love to get more involved with direct sales, and a lot of them are already. They're selling smallish numbers, maybe of lamb and mutton to local markets. They would love to do more, but the infrastructure is not there to help them do that. There's two things that needs to happen. One, that demand needs to be ramped up and satisfied so that you can keep feeding that demand. But the small abattoir situation is just dire, and we're still seeing small abattoirs close. And the more we tap into that big export market, in my mind, the more we're going to see a breakdown of the infrastructure that is required to serve that localized market. And that's why I think when we're talking about food and a food summit, we need to be thinking about every part of our food chain, including exports, but very much including our domestic market and very much including our localized markets as well.
Thank you. And of course, when we're talking about localized infrastructure and income coming into farms so that, we're able to keep prices low, there's also an element to which we need to be thinking about fiber production as well, things that are largely waste products, in the UK today, whether that's wool or leather, how we process these, how we actually, reinstate some of the processing that's necessary for those elements, because of course, most of our clothing, most of our fiber comes from petrochemicals as well. And all of that needs to change over the course of the next decade or two. More than 60%, I think, is petrochemical. So finally, for me, before we go to audience questions, Ben, who needs to take responsibility for these enormous food system challenges that we've all been discussing today? Is the onus on the state or the private sector or civil society, organisations like Sustain, or indeed on individuals themselves?
I was just typing in the chat box saying I couldn't agree more with Phil, and sort of putting in links to it. I've got lots of other links to it, so it's true. But on your point, Finlo, of course everyone shares some responsibility, but the only thing that will change the status quo is going to be meaningful government action. I was mentioning earlier the survey that's coming out next week, which really supports that, the public support for government for government action, whatever that relates to, whether it's extending soft drinks industry levy or work on advertising. And I think, yes, business plays a part, but you'll get business leaders periodically, but it doesn't make financial sense for them to be sticking their neck out. They'll be at a competitive disadvantage. So you need to have that level playing field for business. Voluntary business approaches do not work. This is something that report after report shows. And I mentioned Henry Dimblby's book. I mean, in that he says 689 failed anti-obesity drives since I think it's 1992. These are voluntary measures on the whole. The only things that have worked has been where there's been meaningful legislation. What more can civil society do? I think we need to be making more noise to try to shift the conversation. I don't know that we're cutting through enough. I think we probably need to be a bit more clever. I think there's some great groups coming through that are bringing different voices to the table. And I think it's really been effective when we've been sort of joining up our working more, whether that's around things like the National Food Strategy and providing that really sort of clear message. Even that has struggled to get the action that we want, but I think it's the only way that we can actually sort of move forward on this.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ben. I'm going to come to the audience for questions in just a moment. So I think one or two of the questions that I've seen in the chat, we've already sort of covered off. And so if people do have burning questions that they'd like to stick in there, now is the time to get them into my brain. Dan, can I come to you in terms of that last question about responsibility? What's your view?
Yeah, I'll chuck a couple of thoughts into the mix that might stir up the debate a little bit. In our society as it exists today, the role of business is to maximise shareholder value within the regulatory framework defined by government. That's it. They have no soul, no conscience. It's not what business does within this side of the revolution. The role of government is to define that regulatory framework and that taxation system that means that our businesses operate in a way that gives us the society that we want to have, and hopefully a reflection of public will. The role of civil society is to give that public will voice in that debate, so we do get the right regulatory framework for our business to act in a responsible manner. Now, that's all just broken at the moment. The other, I think, key point about where responsibility lies is for almost every morsel of food, there is a moment of choice by the person who eats it. And at the moment, this moment in time, that choice is completely warped by this broken system of brainwashing advertising, misinformation on packaging, and a whole bunch of things, and poorly educated people, not when it just comes to cooking, but about just understanding the wider concepts of food. And so we're not giving people an environment where choice, or you can call it responsibility if you prefer, has any opportunity to be successful. And so being that there'll always be choice, we absolutely have to create a transparent, honest, and well-educated food system so that people at least have a chance to make the saying goes, make the better choice the easier choice. And we have so much to do on that. For me, that begins in schools.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Sue, I'm going to come to you with this next question, or this first question from Rebecca S., which is about public procurement. The public procurement, I mean, needs to improve generally, but it certainly needs opening up to smaller farmers, like the dynamic procurement people are working towards. Can anyone give any thoughts on why this still hasn't moved forward, on why public procurement isn't better, and why it isn't better at getting food from smaller producers?
That's a really good question. It's a very timely question. It's for exactly the same reasons that many of us have rehearsed already. We have a system that has scaled up. It has assumed that efficiencies are gained when public institutions scale up their relationships. So most institutions prefer to deal with one or two other institutions because it makes the whole process of negotiating contracts much more straightforward. It does not necessarily make them healthier or better value, certainly not better social value. Now, that all being said, there are some places in the UK that many of us on this call already know about, places like Nottingham and Leicestershire, Preston, and indeed the work that people have been trying to do in Exeter, breaking open those narrow and tight relationships and bringing in a much more diverse set of suppliers, providers to support the local economy as well as what's on the public plate. It requires leadership. It requires really, really persistent and resilient leadership on behalf of the people who are doing the contracting in those public institutions. At the moment, even though in England, particularly the Social Value Act should exist to support that, all of the other conversations that go on inside those institutions are essentially about budgets. So in an incredibly pressured public purse, all of the different institutions are struggling to balance between the sorts of choices they want to make for social care or education or health, and the effort that you have to put in to procure differently. So it does need transitional arrangements. It does need government to exercise leadership to support the transitional arrangements to go from the way things work easily at the moment to the way things could work more effectively in the future. But the good news is, as I say, we've got really good crucibles of learning around the country where institutions have managed to make that progress.
Thank you. Ben, I'm going to come to you because you got your hands up, but I'm going to ask another question first, and then perhaps you can wrap the answers together. And then, Rebecca, I might pass this next question across to you as well. And I guess it's about the disconnect between people in the countryside and people living in urban and suburban areas. So how do we make better food? This is Duncan asking the question, Duncan Williams. How do we make better food available for people on low incomes? How do we get food into places where lots of people live, where there's lots of concrete? Is public procurement the only way, or are there other mechanisms we can use as well, Ben?
Thanks, Finlo. I just wanted to pick up. I'll answer that, and I'll pick up on what Sue was saying. I think one of the I completely agree with what Sue's saying. There are some islands of good practice out there. I suppose the question is, how do we make that the norm? There is this commitment in the government food strategy for 50% of public procurement to be local and or sustainable. But the government has dragged its heels on actually implementing that. And that is also mirrored in a commitment from the Labour Party as well. So the commitment is there, it's just not in place. And I think there needs to be that the stick as well as the carrot. We've got those brilliant leaders, but we also need the rest of them to actually move forward and put in place those systems. And you do see dynamic procurement as being I think a real opportunity to break down some of those barriers. I think Rebecca S was saying this in the chat box about how do we actually get smaller farmers into those procurement setups. And I think previously there has been a real problem with bureaucracy and those smaller producers supplying into those large contracts. And I do think that there are some opportunities with dynamic procurement and the likes of Dixon Foundation supporting this, but that really needs to be catalyzed through that sort of government commitment. And I think just it's also worth saying procurement is still a relatively small share of what we eat and what we buy. So we can't put all our eggs in that basket. We do need to actually look at other things like alternative food retail, shorter supply chains, the stuff that Phil was talking about. And that's an area that we are actually doing a project on, just starting. I'll put some info in the chat box about it, about how you guys can get involved. And on that point around accessing agroecological food, more affordable agroecological food, again, I'll put a link to a project we're doing on that called Bridging the Gap. Procurement is probably one of the best ways, but there are some other examples out there. Things like Alexander Rose are doing quite a lot on this.
Lovely. Rebecca, can I come to you on that question about, trying to get good food affordably from the countryside and into urban areas?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think there's a few comments I'd like to make on this. I mean, firstly, I think all food that we produce can be better, and that is by changing how we produce it. So with healthier soils, using less pesticides or no pesticides, and improving our soils, not using artificial fertilizers, actually will make our base ingredients better quality. So therefore all food can be better. Education, I hate using that word as a blanket statement, but we need to enable people to understand that they can make better food choices, and actually that they need to prioritize food. Because even if you necessarily, if you give people food vouchers, they might not want them, because that's just not where their priorities lie. Food, not fight. So people have got to understand that food is something more than, as we said earlier, just fuel. And agroecological food prices longer term, actually, I think will be more stable than food produced by the means. We aren't here, for example, really affected by what Mr. Putin does, because we don't buy fertilizer. So therefore our prices that we sell have not fluctuated in the same way. So I think there's a whole series of things that we've got to try and change. And it's very interesting because, as I said before, we sell food to people on a daily basis. We have customers that prioritize buying good food, and they understand about good food, and they do that as an activity rather than something else. So I don't think we can go at it from one thing. We could take our amazing food into the city centre, and people might not necessarily want to eat it, because if nothing else, they might not know how to cook with it.
Yeah.
So it's a really multifaceted problem, but I think all food can be better food.
Thanks so much. I think we've probably got time for another couple of questions. This next question I'm going to put to Dan, and then I've got a question I'm going to put to Phil and Martin. So this is the question is, how could we introduce legislation that connects farming and public health? And I guess the broader question is, whether it's legislation or other mechanisms, how can we make that link between public health and the costs to the NHS and general ability, to go out and think and be educated and to work? How do we make those links to the food that we eat?
Gosh, I mean, in the current political environment, I think we always have to come back to the money. So there was a report this week, wasn't there, that said that the members of our society who are struggling most with obesity are costing the NHS twice as much as others, and that maybe we could save 14 billion quid. I think the whole NHS debate needs to come round to saying how we take people off the back of the queue rather than worrying so much about how we take people off the front of the queue. And if we start to think of, the people and the land are the assets that make a country a thing, right? And we're not investing in either of those things. We're letting them both rot and decay. And that will, if we look at the underlying pattern of decline that unfortunately is the history of the UK at this point in time, until we start investing properly in our people and in our land and in their health and well-being, then I think we should, worry about that a great deal. But that that mentality is just not there. We have a neoliberal food culture. And I think that's true of every political party. It's just less so with one than it might be with the other.
Thanks very much, Dan. So this last question, depending on how quickly we go through it, I suppose, is about land use in green belts and a discussion of the grading of land so that we can make sure that planning authorities are encouraged to have a ring of market gardens around every town and city. And more broadly, it's about protecting land which, can be productive and which is close to people in order that it can be used by the general citizenry as well as by the farming population to grow the food that we need. And I wonder, Martin, first of all, and then Phil, if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, the access for people who want to grow their own food and the availability to grow it locally is really important. And I think we need a bigger discussion around that green belt. What is it there for and what's it to do? We could put fruit trees and orchards and all sorts of food production at accessible places for people, but we need them joined up. We also, in some rural communities, around the towns and cities, we need a bit more housing. We need to find the balance of people who are grown to grow that food and look after those animals to be on site. We have kind of made the area an unproductive area and citizens benefit. And we could really focus around food production, local farms, citizens' access to nature and that production, and really join it up. But citizens will need to be engaged as well, because many allotment areas are not full up. Many citizens are not interested in growing food or connecting to where their food comes from. They're time poor or just have no interest. But there is a huge public benefit of getting people out, growing food, connecting with nature, getting some fresh air. And it's not just about the food, it's the exercise and mental health. So that green belt is going to be really important to focus on what's it there to deliver in the future.
Phil, how do we get more people growing food, and indeed, how do we get more people, growing food as farmers themselves?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to do whatever we can do to engage more people with growing food and land management as well. And you see some fantastic examples of urban or green belt food production around cities and villages. We need to do more of that. Sometimes for us, I guess, in the sheep sector, farming sheep close to a village or a town can be really difficult because people, often people don't quite understand livestock, and certainly in that world of dogs, we get some dreadful problems with dog attacks on sheep. So I'm not suggesting that we should really try and integrate sheep production on greenbelt land, but there's some great examples, I think, of urban and community supported agriculture. I think we do need to develop that. I would just like to make one point though, and that is my one criticism of the National Food Strategy was around the way we manage our land in the hills and the uplands. And there was this suggestion that our hills and uplands aren't very productive in terms of food production, and we should turn them into carbon stores and forests and the like. And I think again, there's a real disease of silo thinking and ignoring the fact that a lot of these areas are so multifunctional already. They produce really good high quality protein, lamb and beef, in land that often you can't do much else with. Grass is a great crop for wildlife. If it's managed really well, it stores carbon, and again, measuring that in a more holistic way is really quite difficult. And I think hopefully some of this will start to come out in the land strategy work that is planned, I think, for this summer. But a lot more we need to do to engage the public in lots of different ways with food production, both in urban settings and in the hills and uplands. And again, you think about suggestions that we turn our hills and uplands into forests. You could argue for air quality purposes we need a lot more trees around and in our cities and urban areas too. So we just need to think about this with more open eyes, I think.
Thanks very much. And of course, you and I have had conversations along these lines, which are available on the 8.9 website, both in the video and through articles about the way in which, the uplands can be used for producing both food and public goods along the lines that you've talked about there, and some of which is actually in the Banai Bruchaniog, I think I've pronounced it right, the Brecon Beacons, a plan for the future as well. Look, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much to our panelists, Martin Lines, Rebecca Mayhew, Dan Parker, Phil Stocker, Natalie Bennett, Ben Reynolds and Sue Pritchard. Thank you to you for watching and taking part. Please take a moment to check out the 8.9 Hectares website, 8.9.com, or to search for us 8.9HA on Google. This webinar, if there are bits that you missed, will be on the website later on this afternoon. I'll also release it as a Farmgate podcast when I get a chance to edit it. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now. Thank you.